Mr. President, I rise today to discuss the dangerous and brutal extremist organization called ISIS, the terrorist army which in recent months has overrun vast swaths of Iraq and Syria and is a serious threat to the stability of the region and, in fact, to the international community. But before I do that, I also want to say that ISIS is not the only major problem facing our country. It would be a real tragedy if, in our legitimate concerns about the dangers of ISIS, it would be a real tragedy if we continue to ignore the very serious problems that are taking place right here in the United States of America and impacting tens of millions of working families. Madam President, there are crises here at home that we have ignored too long. Real unemployment today is 12%. Youth unemployment is 20%. We can't ignore it. The minimum wage nationally is a starvation wage of $7.25 an hour. We cannot ignore that reality. We have to raise the minimum wage. Madam President, women earn 77 cents to the dollar that men earn. That is unfair. We cannot ignore the issue of pay equity. We've got to address that issue. Senator Boxer was just on the floor talking about the planetary crisis of global warming and the fact that virtually the entire scientific community is united in telling us that global warming is real. It is significantly caused by human activity. It is already causing devastating problems in our country and around the world. We cannot continue to ignore the crisis of global warming. Madam President, last week, many of us voted to overturn the disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision that allows billionaires the ability to spend unlimited sums of money to buy elections, which will benefit candidates who support the rich and the powerful. My point, Madam President, is that while we address the very serious problems in the Middle East, and these are very serious problems, we cannot take our eye off the very serious problems facing tens of millions of Americans. Madam President, the issue involving ISIS, in my view, is enormously complex. Just one example. In Syria, the Assad government is a dictatorship which has killed many thousands of its own people and has even used, we believe, chemical weapons against its own citizens. And these are the good guys. Decisions we make now in Syria, in Iraq, in the Middle East must be made with great thoughtfulness. As you know, President Obama has been attacked time and time again because he publicly stated a while ago that, quote, we don't have a strategy yet, end of quote, for dealing with ISIS. Frankly, I applaud the president for trying to think through this incredibly complicated issue and not make rash decisions which would make a very bad and dangerous situation even worse and more dangerous. Madam President, I remember back in 2002, I was then in the House of Representatives, when George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, they did have a strategy. They were tough. They were forceful. They acted boldly. They acted swiftly. But unfortunately, what they did was dead wrong. In fact, it was the worst foreign policy blunder in the recent history of America and opened up the can of worms that we are trying to deal with today. So, frankly, I must say that I am not impressed with all of the tough talk. I want smart policy that will work, that will in fact lead to the destruction of ISIS, not sound bites that may be effective in a political campaign. Let me just take a few moments, Madam President, to lay out some of my concerns. First, President Obama is absolutely right that this struggle will not be successful unless there is a strong international coalition. And let's be clear, ISIS is a terrorist threat not only to the United States, but to Britain, to France, to Germany, to countries throughout Europe, and in fact, to nations throughout the world. More importantly, ISIS, which wants to establish a new caliphate, which includes many countries across a large geographical area, is a major threat in the region to countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Turkey, Qatar, Iran, Jordan, and other countries. Madam President, I very much appreciate the hard work that President Obama and Secretary of State Kerry have undertaken in trying to put together an international coalition that will effectively fight ISIS. We all know how difficult that effort is. But at this point, it appears to me that the kind of coalition we need has yet to come together. Madam President, in my view, ISIS will never be defeated unless the countries in the region, the people in the region, the Muslim world, including Sunni and Shiite nations, stand up to this threat. I know how hard President Obama and Secretary of State Kerry are trying, but we are nowhere near where we need to be in terms of building this coalition at this moment. Madam President, it may surprise many people to know that Saudi Arabia, a country run by an autocratic royal family, which is worth hundreds of billions of dollars, one of the wealthiest families in the world, is a country which was the world's fourth largest defense spender in 2014. Most people don't know that. According to a Reuters article from earlier this year, and I quote, Saudi Arabia beat Britain to become the world's fourth largest defense spender in 2013, end of quote. In other words, Saudi Arabia is now spending more money on arms and the military than is the United Kingdom. The article goes on to cite a report by London's International Institute for Strategic Studies, which estimated Saudi Arabia was spending over $59 billion, a figure researchers said was extremely conservative, pushing it above Britain at $57 billion or France at $52 billion. Once again, Saudi Arabia is spending more on the military, on their military, than is Britain or France. Another article from Bloomberg provides additional details on Saudi Arabia's military strength. And it cites that in 2011, the U.S. government signed an agreement with Saudi Arabia valued at $29 billion. Madam President, end of quotes from Bloomberg, but according to Military Balance, the Royal Saudi Air Force has more than 300 combat-capable aircraft, including 81 F-15 C&D fighter aircraft, 172 advanced F-15S Typhoon and Tornado fighters capable of ground attacks, dozens of C-130 transport aircrafts. This is what the Saudi Arabian Air Force has. Madam President, let me also quote from an article in Forbes which details the strength and numbers of many of the militaries in the Mideast. The article notes, and I quote, "Countries in the region have more than enough power to destroy the Islamic State. Turkey has an army of 400,000. Iran has nearly as many in the army and paramilitaries. Iraq has a nominal army of nearly 200,000 and some 300,000 police. Saudi Arabia has nearly 200,000 army, National Guard, and paramilitary personnel. Syria's military, though degraded by war, numbers some 110,000 plus paramilitaries. Jordan has 74,000 in the army. The Kurdish Peshmerga numbers in the tens of thousands, all of these. But Iraq and Kurdistan has some Air Force ground attack capabilities, end of quote. Furthermore, Madam President, not only are countries in the region not stepping up in the fight against ISIS, but believe it or not, several of these Gulf states are empowering ISIS and al-Qaeda related groups through their financial contribution. A recent article in the Washington Post noted, and I quote, "Kuwait, a U.S. ally whose aid to besieged Syrian civilians has been surpassed only by the United States this year, is also the leading source of funding for al-Qaeda-linked terrorists fighting in Syria's civil war." End of quote. Now, think back not so long ago when the United States of America went to war to push Saddam Hussein's troops out of Kuwait and restored the ruling family. And today we find that Kuwait is the leading source of funding for al-Qaeda-linked terrorists fighting in Syria's civil war. End of quote. The article goes on to state that, quote, "The amount of money that has flowed from Kuwaiti individuals and through organized charities to Syrian rebel groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra totals in the hundreds of millions of dollars." And, Madam President, Kuwait is hardly alone in this effort. As Treasury Department Undersecretary Cohn recently stated, quote, "A number of fundraisers operating in more permissive jurisdictions, particularly in Kuwait and Qatar, are soliciting donations to fund extremist insurgents, not to meet legitimate humanitarian needs." On and on it goes. Madam President, why is all of this of enormous consequence? And the answer is pretty obvious. The worst thing that we can do now is to allow ISIS to portray this struggle as East versus West, as Muslim versus Christian, as the Middle East versus America. That is exactly what they want, and that is exactly what we should not be giving them. In other words, this is not just a question of whether young men and women in Vermont or in North Dakota or in any other state of this country should be putting their lives on the line to defend the billionaire families of Saudi Arabia when Saudi Arabian troops are not in the struggle. This is not just whether the taxpayers of our country and not the billionaire ruling families of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and other countries should be paying for this war. More importantly, it is an understanding that at the end of the day, this war will never be won by the United States alone, but must be won by the people in the region. Should we as the most powerful military in the world, be of help to those people struggling against ISIS? And the answer is obviously yes. Along with the international community, we should be strongly supportive of those countries in the region that are standing up to ISIS. And I personally believe that President Obama is absolutely right in his efforts to judiciously use airstrikes, which at this point have shown some success. But at the end of the day, in my view, the United States of America cannot and should not lead this effort. We must be supportive of other countries in the region who are standing up and fighting against the ISIS terrorist organization. But this fight will have to be fought by countries in the region that are, in fact, most threatened by ISIS. They cannot stand aside. They cannot say, hey, go for it, United States. Thank you, American taxpayers. But we in Saudi Arabia, we don't want our young people involved in this war. We don't want our airplanes involved in the attacks. We don't want our billions to go into this war. We thank you, America. It's really nice of you to do that. And by the way, while you do that, we may play both sides of the issue, and some families may actually fund terrorist organizations. But we really do appreciate your stepping up to the plate, because we are not doing that. So, Madam President, that is where we are today. It is a very complicated, difficult situation. And again, I want to applaud President Obama and Secretary Kerry for trying to work through this. But this is what I worry about. I worry very much that supporting questionable groups in Syria, so-called moderates, who are outnumbered and outgunned by both ISIS and the Assad government. I worry very much that getting involved in that area could open the door to the United States once again being involved in a quagmire, being involved in perpetual warfare. And what happens when the first American plane gets shot down or the first American soldier is captured? What happens then? Already, I am hearing from some of our Republican colleagues who are already talking about the need for U.S. military boots on the ground. That's what they're talking about today. And that concerns me very, very much. So, Madam President, I am going to vote against this continuing resolution because I have very real concerns about the United States getting deeply involved in a war that we should not be deeply involved in. At the end of the day, if this war against this horrendous organization called ISIS is going to be won, it will have to be Saudi Arabia, it will have to be Iraq, it will have to be the people of Syria, it will have to be the people of that region saying, no, we are not going to accept an organization of terrorists like ISIS. And we should be there to help, as should the United Kingdom, as should Britain, as should France, as should Germany. This has got to be an international coalition. But the last thing we need is the United States being the only or the major military power involved in this war. So, Madam President, thank you very much. And with that, I yield the floor.